Right now, social media is exploding with one of those stories that sounds too dramatic to ignore. People are claiming the next Federal Reserve Chair has a secret plan to make America's debt problem disappear. They call it a reset. They call it a quiet cancellation. They call it the moment everything changes. And whenever I hear language like that, I slow down immediately. Because the first rule in money is very simple. When a story sounds magical, somebody is trying to hide the mechanism. America is carrying a debt load so large that most people no longer even process the number. $39 trillion stops feeling like math and starts feeling like weather. It sounds like something you are supposed to accept, not understand. That is a mistake. Because when a country owes that much money, the question is never whether something will be done. The question is who will pay for what gets done. And that is the real story here. Not whether some incoming chair can wave a wand. Not whether there is a secret room with a secret button. Not whether the debt will literally vanish. The real story is much harder, much quieter, and much more dangerous to ordinary savers. When governments cannot raise enough taxes, cannot cut enough spending, and cannot grow fast enough to outrun the burden, they usually reach for the same tool. They make the currency buy less over time. They reduce the real value of the debt by reducing the real value of the dollar. If you understand that one sentence, you are already ahead of most of the noise online. When I look at situations like this, I always begin with the arithmetic. The debt itself is enormous, yes, but the thing that should really make you sit upright is the interest bill. When the interest on yesterday's borrowing grows large enough to crowd out tomorrow's priorities, the system begins to lose room to maneuver. At that point, politicians still smile, markets still open, the respectable options become smaller, the quiet options become more attractive. Raise taxes aggressively. That sounds satisfying until you run the numbers and discover it does not close a hole this size. Spending. People love that sentence until they have to name the programs to cut. Outgrow the problem that works only if growth outruns debt accumulation for long enough, and that is a much tougher race than most people admit. So what is left in the end? Governments with too much debt are always tempted by the same path. Let inflation do part of the work, hold rates lower than they otherwise would be. Let savers earn less than the rate at which purchasing power is melting. Let time do the dirty work politics cannot do in public. That is not fantasy. That is a pattern. And if you miss that pattern, you will keep looking for a dramatic event while your wealth is being nibbled to death in plain sight. Now let me say something most people either misunderstand or repeat too lazily. The Federal Reserve is presented to the public as if it were just another arm of Washington. It is not that simple. The system was designed as a hybrid structure with a board in Washington, regional reserve banks, and member banks embedded in the architecture. That design matters because it tells you something essential about modern finance. The machinery is always built to preserve the system first, stability first, asset values first. The ordinary saver comes later. I learned very early that once you understand who gets protected first in a financial system, you stop being shocked by outcomes. That does not require conspiracy thinking, it requires structural thinking. The system does not need villains in dark rooms, it only needs incentives. And incentives are far more reliable than villains. So when people online tell you there is a hidden debt cancellation plan, I would reframe it this way. There is no magic eraser. There is only a familiar policy bias. When debt gets too heavy, the burden is often shifted away from the debtor in nominal terms and onto the holder of money in real terms. That is the transfer. That is the mechanism. That is what people feel without being able to name. And before you dismiss that as abstract, go look backward. After World War II, the United States came out with a debt burden that looked suffocating for its time. Yet over the following decades, that burden fell dramatically relative to the size of the economy. It was not solved by one clean, heroic act. It was worked down through a mixture of growth, inflation, and a financial environment in which interest rates were often held below inflation long enough for the debt to get lighter in real terms. That is the playbook people are sensing, even if they describe it badly. Debt does not have to be paid off in the way households imagine. Sometimes it is diluted. Sometimes it is softened. Sometimes it is survived by making the measuring stick weaker. If I owe you $100 and over time, the purchasing power of the dollar gets cut in half, the face amount of the debt did not change, but the burden did. That is what governments understand. And because it happens gradually, the public rarely experiences it as a vote, a law, or a confession. They experience it as higher prices, weaker savings power, and the strange realization that the numbers in their accounts look stable while their real position is slipping. That is why I keep telling people the first thing to protect in an age like this is not your account balance. It is your purchasing power. Those are not the same thing. A statement that holds the same dollar number year after year can still be a record of slow financial loss. And once you see it that way, the winner and loser map becomes very clear. The winners in a financially repressed world are usually the people who own businesses with pricing power, strong equities, good real estate, scarce hard assets, things that can adjust with the currency or outrun it. The losers are the people who trust nominal stability, large idle cash balances, long-duration fixed claims locked at mediocre yields, households whose savings earn less than the rate at which their living costs rise, salaried people who think a flat number on a paycheck means life is holding still when it is actually getting more expensive around them. Wealth does not disappear in these periods, it moves, and it usually moves away from the passive holder of money toward the owner of assets. That is one of the oldest transfers in finance. Now, a lot of the viral talk around this story gets sloppy when it turns to personnel. One incoming chair does not become emperor. One name does not control the whole machine. Markets love to turn committees into kings because it makes the story easier to sell. Reality is slower than that, messier than that, more institutional than that. But that should not comfort you too much, because the big risk is not that one man enters a building on one date and flips one switch. The big risk is that the system drifts in a direction that is entirely predictable, while ordinary people keep waiting for a headline dramatic enough to confirm what is already happening. The drift matters more than the date. The regime matters more than the rumor, and that brings me to what I would actually do, because this is where people either get serious or stay entertained. First, understand the real enemy. The enemy is not a technical default in the way people imagine. A country that issues its own currency has tools a household does not have. The more realistic danger for most citizens is not formal default. It is silent dilution. It is that your dollars continue to exist while each one buys less life. That is the danger you need to measure. Not how many dollars you have. How much bread, housing, energy, health care, and freedom those dollars can still command. Second, own assets that can live in a weaker money world. When I say that, I do not mean chasing junk because it sounds exciting. I mean the opposite: high-quality businesses, productive assets, things with durability, companies that can raise prices because customers still need what they sell, real assets with scarcity behind them, sensible diversification instead of concentrated fantasy. The wrong response to a fragile currency regime is panic speculation. The right response is disciplined ownership. You do not solve currency weakness by becoming reckless. You solve it by becoming harder to dilute. Third, avoid the classic traps. The first trap is thinking cash is safety. Cash is useful. Cash is necessary. Cash is optionality. But large piles of unproductive cash in an inflationary or financially repressed environment are not safety. They are exposure. The second trap is reaching for fixed returns that look comfortable but lock you into losses in real terms if inflation outruns them. The third trap is freezing, doing nothing because the story sounds too big, too political, too complicated. That is how most people get hurt. Not through one dramatic mistake, through calm inaction while the structure changes underneath them. I have seen this over and over. People tell themselves they will act when things become obvious. But by the time things are obvious, the best prices are gone, the best positioning is behind you, and the cost of delay has already been paid. That is true in markets. That is true in business. That is true in life. So let me strip the emotion out of this and leave you with the clean version. No, There is probably not a secret plan to make $39 trillion disappear overnight. No, one Fed chair is not going to arrive like a magician and erase arithmetic. No, you should not organize your financial life around viral slogans. But yes, the debt burden is real. Yes, the interest burden is real. Yes. History shows that governments often reduce debt burdens through inflation and financial repression, rather than through noble public sacrifice. Yes, that process benefits asset owners more than savers. And yes, if you stay positioned like a passive saver while the world moves into that kind of regime, you are volunteering to finance the adjustment. That is the part most people miss. They think the question is whether the government can save itself. The real question is whether you are positioned so that the government's way of saving itself does not quietly drain you. If you want one phrase to remember, make it this: in a world trying to make debt lighter, do not sit on the wrong side of the currency. Own pieces of productive reality. Think in purchasing power, not nominal comfort. Stop waiting for a perfect headline. The transfer does not begin when the public agrees on its name. It begins when the incentives line up. And in my experience, by the time the crowd starts calling something a reset, the people who understand the structure have already started moving. That is why I would not spend my time asking whether the debt can be canceled. I would spend my time asking a much harder question. If the next decade is built to make money worth less, what do I own that gets stronger when that happens? That is the question that matters. That is the question the serious money asks first. And that is the question I would answer before the crowd realizes the game was never about cancellation in the first place. It was about transfer.